"Daddy, please come home. She's hurting me again." The words had played on loop in Alexander Knight's head from the moment his jet's wheels scraped the runway. A tiny, trembling voice file that had ripped through the polished armor he'd spent a lifetime building, cutting deeper than a hostile takeover or a market crash ever could. And now, as the black Rolls-Royce Phantom hissed through the rain-slick streets toward the estate, he heard them again. Clear as if his daughter sat right beside him instead of God, knew what was happening to her in that vast house he'd foolishly believed to be safe. The wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the windshield. The city's lights smeared into streaks of gold and red through the water. But Alexander saw none of it as he gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel so hard his knuckles blanched, jaw clenched, shoulders tight under his rain-darkened suit. Every inch of his 6'2" frame coiled like a spring that had been compressed too far for too long. He was a man who owned companies that bought other companies, a man whose signature shifted billions, who could pick up the phone and move freight across oceans or satellites into orbit. But right now all of that felt obscene, useless, because he hadn't been able to protect the one small person whose whispered "Daddy" had once made him feel like a knight in shining armor rather than just a knight with a capital K on the glass of a skyscraper. And it was that failure, that crack in the self-image he curated so carefully, that made his hands shake as he replayed the voicemail yet again with a thumb tap on the console. Static, a little hitch of breath, then Lily's voice, thin, rushed, trying so hard to be brave. "Daddy, please come home. She's hurting me again," followed by a muffled shuffle, a distant door slam, something like a choked-back sob before the message cut off, leaving a silence that had made the luxurious cabin of his Gulfstream feel like a coffin suspended above the world as he'd barked at the pilot to divert to land, to shave minutes off procedures that were supposed to be meticulous. His security chief's voice tinny in his AirPods as he demanded updates from half a planet away. Now alone in the car because he dismissed the driver the second they left the airport and slid behind the wheel himself. As if the physical act of driving could bleed off some of the helplessness, he tried to string the scattered facts together in his mind. Lily home from piano. Apollonia, the housekeeper, confirmed she'd come in at 4:30. Cassandra allegedly in her studio working. Staff dismissed early because of the storm, as she'd told his PA on a curt call, a detail that had made the hair on the back of Alexander's neck rise even at 35,000 feet. Because Cassandra liked an audience, liked control, liked things done her way. And 3 years ago, when he'd first met her at a charity gala, that command of a room had seemed like confidence, rather than the narcissistic need to arrange the world to flatter her angles and soothe her insecurities. But hindsight had a way of sketching bone structure beneath the makeup. He blew out a breath and forced his fingers to flex on the wheel, trying to unclench his mind from the well-worn track of self-recrimination long enough to plan. Because panic wouldn't help Lily, and Alexander had built his empire on the ability to think clearly while everyone else was losing their heads. But it was harder now, pressed under a different kind of pressure, the kind that started the night he'd stood in a hospital corridor. 29, and far more terrified than any deal had ever made him, watching his then-wife, Elise, struggle through 19 hours of labor to bring their daughter into the world. He could still see Lily as she'd been then, tiny, red-faced, howling indignantly at existence from the crook of his arm, fingers the size of paperclips curling around his thumb with surprising strength. The name they'd chosen because Elise loved flowers, and he'd secretly wanted something soft to balance the severity of night. Then, 3 years later, Elise's laugh echoing in the lit kitchen at 3 in the morning, as she told him she loved him but couldn't live in his shadow, couldn't breathe under the weight of his schedule and expectations, and the way money insulated him from the compromises other people simply had to make, her fingertips trembling even as she tried for a theatrical flourish. The empty vodka bottle on the counter not quite as empty as she claimed her feelings to be. Divorce papers and rehab stints and custody hearings had followed, and through it all Lily had clung to him with the implicit faith of a child who didn't understand adult failure, whose world narrowed to "Daddy, here, therefore I'm safe." And when the court granted him primary custody on the grounds of Elise's unpredictable sobriety, he'd sworn silently to himself that he would build a moat around that safety, that nothing would breach it. Not a market crash, not another woman, not his own ambition. Yet somewhere along the way, he had done exactly the thing he'd thought himself too smart, too self-aware to do. He'd let another woman into their fortress and assumed his judgment would be enough to vet her. Cassandra Hart, now Cassandra Knight, had been a photographer with sharp cheekbones and a sharper wit, a glossy presence at art fairs and fundraisers, her portfolio full of haunting portraits and high-contrast fashion editorials, the kind of self-possessed woman who walked into a room and bent its axis subtly toward herself without seeming to try. And in the vacuum left by Elise's chaos, Cassandra's cool control had been intoxicating. She'd smiled at Lily with a practiced softness at first, the way someone smiles at a client's child, but then seemed to thaw, bringing the girl little gifts from her shoots, an old Polaroid camera, a box of costume jewelry, a vintage silk scarf, offering to take her on little adventures into the city, showing her how to frame the world through a lens. And when Lily's eyes had lit up at the sight of herself on glossy paper, Alexander had felt a knot loosen in his chest. They were bonding, he'd thought, against the whispered warnings from friends who knew Cassandra's reputation for volatility, for burning hot and cold in relationships. The first time Lily said, quietly but clearly, "Daddy, I do like how she talks to me when you're not here." He'd been in the middle of negotiations in Zurich, phone pinned between shoulder and ear, as he signed off on a multi-million-dollar contract, and he'd heard the whine of tiredness in her voice, the way children sometimes paint the world in stark hues when bedtime looms, so he'd smoothed it over with promises to talk later, then later had become never. Smothered beneath the avalanche of urgent things that paid for the house and the private school and the music lessons, and all the trappings he'd convinced himself were synonyms for love. Now his mind replayed that dismissal with nauseating clarity as rain hammered the hood, because it was the second time Lily had tried to tell him that really mattered, the message on his phone being the third. And if there was one thing Alexander Knight loathed more than anything, it was missing a signal, misreading the data, making the wrong bet, except this bet hadn't been on a currency or a stock. It had been on a person he'd brought into his daughter's life, and then trusted with her bedtime and her scraped knees and her tears when he wasn't there, which was far too often. He checked the dashboard clock and swore under his breath, cutting across a lane a little more aggressively than he normally would, the Phantom's engine responding with a silky surge, the city blurring by in streaks of concrete and glass. He'd landed 2 hours earlier than planned because the pilot, perhaps sensing something in his employer's unusually ragged tone, had shaved corners where he could, and Alex had spent that time on the ground doing the only things that made him feel slightly less like he was drowning. He'd called his head of security, Mark Davison, ordering him to redirect 2 men from the downtown office to the estate as a visible presence. He'd phoned his attorney, Dahlia Cho, and asked her to prepare for the possibility of an emergency custody motion, her crisp voice on the other end assuring him she'd start assembling affidavits and prior incident reports. And he'd texted Apollonia in a code they'd used for years. "Wind coming up the hill, lock the windows." To which she had responded, "Windows shut, little flower in her room," a confirmation that Lily was at least physically located. But texts and calls were data points, not the ground truth of what his daughter was feeling right now, which might be terror, pain, confusion, or, in the nightmare his brain kept conjuring, numb resignation. The way people sometimes shut down when the person hurting them also controlled the walls of their world. The main gates of the Knight estate loomed up out of the rain, dark wrought iron slick with water, flanked by stone pillars topped with cameras, and as Alexander rolled down the tinted window to punch in his code, he saw the familiar red LED wink, the gates swinging inward with their usual stately grace. And the sight filled him with an irrational surge of anger because it was all too orderly, too smooth. The machine of his life still functioning as designed, while something utterly unacceptable might be happening at its center. He gunned the car up the long, tree-lined drive, wipers flinging sheets of water aside, the mansion coming into view, a three-story sprawl of glass and stone perched above the city, lights glowing warm in some windows, others dark, the house of a man who'd made it, of a family that should have had every advantage. And for the first time since he'd signed the purchase papers, he thought it looked like a fortress where a dragon could live just as easily as a princess. He parked at the front steps without bothering to angle the Phantom properly, killing the engine so abruptly the sudden silence roared in his ears louder than the rain. Then he was out, the storm slapping him in the face, suit soaking within seconds as he took the marble steps 2 at a time, keycard in his hand even though he knew the front door would be unlocked while Cassandra was home. She liked people to be able to come in and see how she lived, liked staff bustling. But tonight when he pushed the heavy wood, it moved more slowly, as if weighted, and the foyer beyond was oddly still. The chandelier cast a soft glow over the polished floor, reflecting the abstract art on the walls. The fresh flowers on the console table were arranged in perfect spirals, Cassandra's touch. And yet there were no footsteps, no muted conversations from the kitchen, no clatter of dishes, no music drifting from her studio upstairs. Only the distant patter of rain on glass and the faint hum of the climate system, and that quiet pressed against Alexander's eardrums like a held breath. Lily. He called, voice echoing in the high ceilings, all pretense at calm gone now, the word breaking slightly as if his throat were too narrow to let it through. He shrugged off his coat as he moved deeper into the house, leaving it in a wet heap on the console rather than handing it to someone who wasn't there. His shoes squeaking faintly on the marble, hand automatically brushing against the pocket where his phone sat, still open to Lily's last call. A soft creak sounded from the far hallway and his head snapped in that direction, muscles standing out at the corners of his jaw, but it was only Apollonia stepping out from the service corridor, her dark hair escaping its bun, eyes wide when they landed on him. "Senor Alex," she breathed, hands wringing in her apron, her usually unflappable demeanor frayed, "you came fast. Where is she?" He demanded, not snapping at the woman who'd rocked his daughter to sleep 100 times but unable to smooth the sharpness from his tone, urgency flaying his patience. "In her room," Apollonia said, glancing nervously up toward the second floor. "I stayed close, but when Mrs. Cassandra sent staff home early, she insists I go too, only I say no for storm. I think I hear voices, but the music was loud in the studio. Her voice trailed off, shame flickering across her features even though Alexander knew, rationally, that Cassandra's word was law for most of the staff and fear of losing their job was no small thing. He placed a steadying hand briefly on Apollonia's shoulder. "You did enough," he said curtly but not unkindly. "Go downstairs, call Mark, tell him I'm here and to hold outside until I call him again. And Apollonia, thank you for staying." Her eyes filled with quick tears of relief and guilt as she nodded and hurried away, phone already in hand. And Alexander turned toward the wide staircase, his footsteps pounding in his ears as he took them 2 at a time, bypassing the landing where a large framed photograph by Cassandra hung. Lily in a field at dusk, face half in shadow, hair blown across her eyes. An image he had once thought artistic, and now realized maybe said more about how Cassandra saw his daughter than he'd ever wanted to admit. The corridor to the family bedroom stretched ahead, thick carpet muffling the sound of his stride, door after door closed, each one a line of possibility his mind wanted to peer behind. But he kept moving until he reached the white door at the end, the one with a crooked paper sign Lily had taped up herself years ago. "Keep out, unless you bring snacks." The "unless" added later in pink marker under her original fierce black scrawl. His heart thudded against his ribs so hard it hurt as he raised his hand and knocked gently, then more firmly when there was no answer. "Lily, it's Daddy," he called, voice lower than usual, trying not to transmit the panic crackling just under his skin. "Open the door, sweetheart." For a long moment there was nothing, and then the faint pad of bare feet, the soft click of the handle, and the door creaked open a fraction to reveal one wide hazel eye, red-rimmed and glistening, framed by tangled dark lashes. For a second that felt like a year, they just looked at each other. Alexander drinking in the smallness of her, the way her lower lip trembled, the way her hand clutched the door as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. And then the eye widened fully with recognition and something like despairing relief. "Daddy," she whispered, and the dam inside him cracked. He shoved the door fully open with more force than he meant to, then checked himself, not wanting to startle her, stepping into the pastel-painted room that smelled faintly of baby shampoo and crayons, and the vanilla candle Apollonia always lit when Lily had nightmares. Lily stood there in an oversized t-shirt that came to her knees, bare legs goose-pimpled, hair in messy braids, and though Alexander forced himself not to scan her like an investigator, his gaze couldn't help noticing the way she flinched when the door hit the wall, how one of her slender arms was held slightly behind her back as if shielding it, the shadows under her eyes too deep for an 8-year-old. He went down to one knee in front of her, soaking his trousers without caring, bringing himself level with her gaze. "Hey," he said softly, reaching out but stopping short of touching her until she moved first. "I'm here now." For a heartbeat she hesitated, as if uncertain whether he were real or just a trick her mind was playing in the space after a wish. And then she launched herself forward, colliding with his chest so hard he rocked back, her arms wrapping around his neck with desperate strength, fingers digging into his shoulders, a small sob punching out of her. He closed his arms around her carefully, cradling the back of her head, feeling how slight her ribs were under his palm, and something inside him that had been wound tight for 38 years finally snapped, not in a way that broke him, but in the sense of armor falling away to reveal raw, unvarnished rage and love. "It's okay," he murmured into her hair, ignoring the sting in his eyes. "You're okay, I've got you. No one is going to hurt you while I'm here." At his words she shuddered, a tiny convulsion he felt all the way down to his bones, and he leaned back enough to see her face, thumb brushing a tear track away. "You left me," she blurted in a rush that tasted less like accusation than like a confession. "I called and you didn't answer and her voice strangled off, her eyes darting toward the corner of the room where a toppled chair lay near the small desk where she did her homework, a coloring book splayed open, crayons scattered like debris. Alexander's gaze followed, then slid reluctantly to her left forearm, where the cuff of the t-shirt had ridden up just enough to reveal the faint outline of finger-shaped reddening on pale skin, and a small, shallow bruise blooming near her elbow, not dark, not gruesome, but damning enough that his breath left him in a hiss. He swallowed the immediate murderous impulse that flared, images of storming down the hall, of putting his hands on Cassandra with a fraction of the force she'd used on a child, and forced himself to catalog instead. Marks not too old, fear not fully processed, no obvious breaks or severe swelling, no blood, thank God, no blood. "I'm sorry I didn't answer," he said, voice low and fierce with self-disgust, eyes locked on hers instead of the bruise so she would not feel examined like evidence. I should have been here sooner, but I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. Do you understand me, Lily? No one touches you like that and walks away, not ever again." Her chin wobbled. "She said it was my fault," Lily whispered, shoulders curling inward, shame where there should have been only anger. "Because I spilled paint on her dress and then I ruined her pictures and you always take my side, so she has to teach me." Alexander pressed his thumb very gently under her chin, lifting her face. "Look at me," he said, with the same authority he used in boardrooms but softer around the edges. When her eyes met his, he held them. "Nothing you did or did not do justifies someone putting their hands on you. Dropping paint, breaking things, talking back, even screaming, none of it. Grown-ups are supposed to control themselves. If they don't, that is about them, not you. Do you hear me?" She nodded, a tiny jerk of her head, not fully convinced but clinging to his certainty because she had none of her own yet, and he kissed her forehead before standing, lifting her easily into his arms despite her protesting that she was too big to be carried. a protest undermined by the way she tucked herself in against his chest, arms hooking around his neck with familiar trust. "Where is she?" he asked quietly as he stepped into the corridor, his tone losing all softness even if he fought to keep it from sounding like a growl. Lily's small hand tightened in his shirt. "In her room," she said, voice going breathy the way prey animals go still when they know a predator is near. "She said if I come out again she'll—" "She won't," Alexander cut in, more sharply than he meant to, then gentled it. "She won't because I'm going to talk to her, and then some people whose job it is to protect kids are going to talk to her too, okay? Mark is downstairs. We're not alone." Outside the master's suite at the far end of the hall, faint music pulsed through the door, a bass line from some atmospheric playlist Cassandra used when she created. And the sound seemed obscene now, like a soundtrack for denial, the world inside that room clearly out of step with what had been happening down the hall. Alexander set Lily down just inside her own doorway. "Stay here," he told her, his voice brooking no argument. "Close the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Apollonia or Mark. If you hear shouting, you put your hands over your ears and you remember this. You did nothing wrong." Her eyes filled again. "Promise you won't leave," she whispered. "I promise," he said, and this time he felt the vow anchor into something deeper than convenience or habit. He waited until she closed the door, heard the soft click of the lock, then turned and walked toward the master's suite, each step measured, because he knew that if he let himself run, he might also let himself lose the last thread of restraint. And while part of him craved the release of fury, a colder, more disciplined part knew that Cassandra's greatest weapon had always been her ability to play victim, to twist narratives until people questioned their own eyes, and if he burst in yelling, hands clenched, she would simply have more material. He knocked once, a courtesy he did not want to extend but did anyway for the record, then opened the door without waiting for a response. The master bedroom was a study in curated decadence. Velvet drapes, a low platform bed with artfully rumpled linen, large framed photographs by Cassandra on the walls, including one of Alexander himself in shadow that had seemed sexy at the time and now looked like a stranger. Candles flickered on the dresser, though it was only early evening. Their scent a heavy floral that made his throat itch. And near the floor-to-ceiling windows Cassandra stood in a silk slip, a glass of red wine in one hand, her phone in the other, the screen's light reflecting off the sharp planes of her face as she scrolled, oblivious or pretending to be. She looked up when he came in, annoyance flashing before she schooled it into a languid smile. "You're home early," she said, taking in his wet clothes, the tightness around his eyes and something like wariness flickering beneath the surface of her charm. "The deal in Singapore fell through. Turn the music off," Alexander said without preamble, his voice flat as stone. Cassandra's eyes narrowed briefly, but she tapped her phone and the bass line cut out, leaving only the rain ticking faintly against the glass. "What's this about?" she asked, arching one perfectly shaped brow, every inch the aggrieved hostess whose evening had been interrupted. "Did something happen at the office?" He stepped closer, enough that he could see the fine lines beginning at the corners of her eyes, the slight tightness around her mouth he hadn't noticed before, the way her hand tightened on the wine glass when he didn't kiss her cheek or make some quip. "Don't insult both of us by pretending you don't know what this is," he said quietly. "I got a message from Lily." For a heartbeat, something like genuine confusion darted across Cassandra's face, then rearranged itself into a smirk. "She's dramatic, Alex," she said, toss of hair practiced. "You know that. She spilled paint all over my new dress, then had a meltdown when I told her to clean it up. Children say all kinds of things when they don't get their way. You can't just abandon meetings and fly halfway across the world every time she cries." "I didn't hear crying," he said, moving another step in tone still maddeningly calm, though his heart pounded. "I heard fear. Real fear, Cassandra. I came home to my daughter hiding in her room with finger marks on her arm." Her gaze flicked involuntarily to his hands as if she imagined them on her, then back up. "You can't seriously be accusing me of child abuse," she scoffed, though there was a tightness in her throat. "I barely touched her." She was hysterical, waving her arms. She made a quick grabbing motion, as if replaying it, took hold of her so she would stop. If she bruises that easily, that's hardly my fault. Maybe you should ask her pediatrician about her diet instead of coming after me. He let the silence stretch until even the rain seemed to pause. Say that again, he murmured, and something in his tone made her step back, hip hitting the edge of the bed. Say you barely touched her. Oh, for God's sake, Alex, she snapped, facade cracking, wine sloshing in her glass, a flush rising under her flawless makeup. I raised my voice. I grabbed her arm. Yes, but you weren't here. You never are. You don't see how she pushes, how she tests, how she talks back. She's spoiled. She needs boundaries. And if you won't give them to her, someone has to. The world isn't going to coddle her because she's your little princess. You do not get to talk about the world's hardness to me, he said, the words coming out so cold that the room itself seemed to drop a degree. I know exactly how hard it is. That's why I do everything in my power to make sure she has one place where she doesn't have to armor up. And I trusted you to be part of that. I brought you into her life, into this house, into our routines. You had one non-negotiable condition. You don't put your hands on my daughter in anger. You broke that. Cassandra's eyes glittered. You're being ridiculous, she said, but the certainty was ebbing from her posture as she realized this was not one of the arguments she could spin back in her favor with tears and sex and a half-truth about his absenteeism. You're going to blow up our marriage over one little. This conversation isn't about our marriage, he cut in. This is about Lily. You and I can dissolve quietly or fight it out in court later. I don't care. What matters right now is that you understand the part of this you don't get to negotiate. You will not be alone with my daughter again. As of tonight, I'm the custodial parent under this roof, and you are a guest whose welcome is tenuous at best. She let out a sharp laugh that had no humor in it. You can't be serious, she said. You're not even here half the time. You think you can just swoop in, play hero, and erase me from her life because she tattled on me after a tantrum. I have rights, Alexander. You have a prenup, he said, and I have full legal custody of Lily. You knew that when you married me. You signed papers acknowledging you were not her guardian. I tried to make this a family for you as well as for her. I gave you everything, this house, access, trust. You repaid it by hurting her and telling her it was her fault. I've seen that cycle before, Cassandra. I watched it with my own mother, and I'll be damned before I let it repeat. For the first time, something like genuine fear flickered behind her eyes as she realized he was not bluffing, that this was not one of their usual rows about his travel schedule or her spending. She set the wine glass down too quickly, stem rattling on the nightstand. You're overreacting, she said more quietly, but the edge was still there. Children bruise, they exaggerate. You weren't here. You don't get to judge how hard it is to be the one picking them up from school, dealing with their moods, soothing them when they wake up screaming for a mother who checked out years ago. Do not bring Elise into this to excuse your choices, he said, the single most dangerous thread in his voice now a quiet one. Elise had her demons. We all do. But even at her worst, she never laid a hand on Lily. She walked away instead, and while that damaged our daughter in its own way, it did not expressly teach her that love comes with pain. You did that. You don't get to wrap it in psychological jargon and call it necessary. He took his phone from his pocket, hit a speed dial, and lifted it to his ear while she watched, lips parted as if he were pulling a weapon. Mark. He said when the security chief picked up immediately, I'm upstairs with Cassandra. Lily is safe in her room. I want you and one of your men at the base of the main staircase. No one leaves the house until the police arrive. Yes, I said police, and call Dahlia. Tell her it's time. Cassandra's composure shattered. She surged toward him, eyes wild. You are not calling the police on me, she hissed, low enough that it wouldn't carry down the hall but intense enough to lacerate. I will tell them you hit me, that you're the one. You've threatened that before, he said, snapping his phone closed, not giving her the satisfaction of hearing the officer's voice yet, because he knew mixing that reality into this moment would send her panic skyward. And every time I let it pass, told myself you were just blowing off steam, that you were wounded and scared and lashing out. That stops now, Cassandra. My patience for self-justified cruelty is gone. You want to talk to the authorities? Great. We'll all talk to them. They can see the marks on Lily's arm, they can hear her voicemail, they can see the staff schedules that show who was in the house. They can look at your history. I'm done pretending this is a private matter." She froze at the word history, the file she'd begged him not to read, the one Dahlia had compiled before their marriage outlining previous restraining orders from an ex-boyfriend, an incident with a niece she dismissed as "my sister being dramatic," stories he'd half believed and half dismissed as people not understanding her temperament. For a second he saw in her eyes not just anger but a flash of the broken thing underneath, the little girl she'd once been, maybe hit or belittled in some bland middle-class kitchen by someone who told her she'd brought it on herself. But compassion now, directed at her, would be at Lily's expense, and Alexander finally understood which side of that trade he stood on. "Get out," he said, voice suddenly tired as if every cell in his body had aged 10 years since landing. "Pack a bag. You can stay in the guest house tonight, with Mark posted at the door. Tomorrow, Dahlia will send you a list of items you may remove from the property and a schedule to collect them. We will discuss details through lawyers. You will not attempt to see or contact Lily unless and until. You will not attempt to see or contact Lily unless and until a court says otherwise. If you try to go near her room, if you raise your voice to her again, if you so much as look at her with anything but distance, I will ensure that every door that has ever opened for you because of my name closes." For a second she just stared, mouth open, as if she couldn't quite process the end of the story she'd been writing for herself on his money, and then her features contorted, a storm of rage twisting them into something almost unrecognizable. "You're pathetic," she spat. "You think this makes you a hero? All it does is prove you're just like every man I've ever known, choosing the safer option, the one that makes you look good instead of staying to fix what you helped break. You'll regret this, Alex. When she turns on you the way she turned on me, when she ruins something you care about, you'll wish you'd let me toughen her up." He didn't flinch. "If Lily grows up questioning my decisions, that will mean she grew up feeling safe enough to question things," he said. "I can live with that. What I can't live with is her growing up thinking love sounds like your voice on a bad day." He opened the door and stepped aside, an unmistakable invitation to leave, and after a long, electric moment, Cassandra grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began stuffing clothes into it with furious movements, muttering under her breath. He left her to it, stepping back into the hall just as Mark and another security officer, both in plain clothes but with the unmistakable alertness of men used to trouble, came up the stairs. "She's packing," Alexander said briefly. "Police on their way. Nobody stops her from gathering her own things, but she does not go near Lily's room. Stay on this floor until the uniforms arrive, then coordinate with them." Mark's gaze searched his employer's face, taking in the damp hair, the wet shirt, the fight buried behind his eyes. "Understood," he said simply, no questions, just the kind of loyalty Alexander paid for and in this moment desperately appreciated. "How's the kid?" Alexander's throat tightened. "Scared," he said, "but alive." "That's a start." He walked back down the hall to Lily's door and knocked softly. "It's me," he called. "It's safe to open." A pause, then the lock clicked and she peeked out, eyes scanning him and the corridor beyond, catching a glimpse of Mark's broad shoulders down the hall and visibly relaxing a fraction. "Is she gone?" she asked in a tiny voice. "Soon," he said. "She's packing. There are going to be some visitors, the police, maybe someone else whose job is to talk to you about what happened. You don't have to be afraid of them, okay? They're there to make sure you're safe." She chewed her lip. "Am I in trouble?" The question, laced with pure bewilderment, punched straight through any remaining defenses he had. "No," he said, stepping in and pulling her into a gentle hug again. "You are not in trouble. You did the bravest thing you could. You called me. You told the truth. That's what people do when something bad is happening. They tell, even if someone told them not to. That's what heroes do." "You came," she whispered into his shirt. "I didn't think you would. I thought you were always busy." He closed his eyes, feeling the familiar guilt but letting it sit without immediately trying to rationalize it away with "I did it for you" or "work is how I provide." Instead, he said the only honest thing. "I have been too busy sometimes," he admitted, "and I'm sorry." I thought making more, doing more, being more would make everything safer for you, but I forgot that you don't care about mergers and planes. You care about someone coming when you call. That changes now. I can't promise I'll never leave town again, but I can promise I will never again ignore it when you tell me something is wrong. You come first, Lily Flower, before any deal, before anyone else." She pulled back enough to look at him, searching his face with the unfiltered scrutiny of a child who has heard promises before and learned how easily they can be broken. Whatever she saw there made something in her relax, because she nodded slowly, and for the first time that evening, the edge of a real, if shaky, smile touched the corner of her mouth. As the night unfolded in a blur of uniforms, quiet questions, Dahlia arriving with a folder of papers and a look in her eyes that said, without words, "I've been waiting years for you to see this," as Cassandra's shout of "I'll ruin you" drifted faintly from the guest house where she'd been escorted to stay until lawyers could formalize the exit. Alexander stayed anchored by Lily's side as much as he could, letting the professionals guide the official steps, but never relinquishing the small, warm hand that had clamped around his. When at last the house quieted, rain easing to a patter and then stopping altogether, when the last officer left with a promise that social services would follow up, and Dahlia disappeared into the night to draft filings that would shift the legal landscape of his personal life, as dramatically as any IPO had ever shifted his net worth, Alexander sat on the edge of Lily's bed, watching her breathe in the soft glow of the night light shaped like a crescent moon, her lashes fanned on her cheeks. Band-Aid cartoon characters peeking from under the sleeve covering the bruise he dabbed with ointment, faint marks that would fade, he hoped, far faster than the memory behind them. He thought of the man he'd been that morning in Singapore, focused, efficient, proud of the empire he'd built, and of the man he had been in the car, knuckles white on the wheel, mistakes lined up in his mind like a series of dominoes he was finally willing to see. And he understood that the real measure of his power was not how many zeros followed his name on a balance sheet, but whether he was willing to turn that power inward, to do the painful audit of his own blind spots and change accordingly. Somewhere downstairs his phone buzzed with emails, markets waking up on another continent, but up here the only economy that mattered was the steady rise and fall of a small chest and the whispered word she'd breathed just before slipping into sleep. Home, not as a place but as a person, and he reached out, gently smoothing a strand of hair off her forehead, letting his hand rest there a moment like a blessing, a vow renewed without fanfare. Outside, the clouds tore open to reveal a strip of stars over the city, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander Knight felt like maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning what it meant to truly live up to the name his daughter had always given him. Not Sir, not Mr. Knight, not even Alex, but Daddy, the one who came home when she said she was hurting, and who would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to call like that again.